Welcome to part 2 of this course, talking about the core Azure services. Now, the first part of this course talked about general cloud computing concepts, which can apply to Azure, but also apply to other cloud providers. In this section, we're talking about the services and features of Azure more directly. Now, I don't want you to get too overwhelmed by this. Remember that this is the Azure Fundamentals exam, and so you will not be expected to have detailed knowledge of how to create a virtual machine and what the exact settings are that are available, etc. You're just supposed to understand that these services exist and begin to see how the puzzle pieces fit together in your head. Now, feel free to watch this video again as many times as you need to reinforce the learning. Or check out Microsoft Docs for more details if you wish. In this video, we'll talk about how Azure is divided into geos, regions, and availability zones. As well, we're going to talk about Azure Resource Manager model and how resources are organized into groups. So the second big topic of this exam is to understand core Azure services, and that's worth a full 30 to 35%. This is by far the largest of the sections, although they're all pretty even, but this is 30 to 35%. Now, there's a lot of topics covered. When we expand the requirements on that landing page, we can see we're talking about regions, availability zones, ARM, everything from Azure Marketplace and all of the things that you can get. So we're really going to dive deeper into all of the available services. Now, I said earlier in this course that there are over 1,000 individual services within that. And so we're not going to be able to cover all of them in great detail. So this is going to be a bit of a 30,000 foot view. We'll start off talking about Azure regions. Now, one important benefit of using the cloud is how geographically diverse, a place like Microsoft Azure is. There are currently 54 regions where you can get computing services. I'll put up a map here. We can see that it's basically almost every continent except for Antarctica, but you've got Canada, United States, and Brazil. You've got lots of them in Western Europe. There's 2 new regions that just opened up in Africa, South Africa North and South Africa West. You've got UAE, you've got India, there's Asian regions and Australian regions. So wherever you physically are in the world, chances are there is Azure computing services not too far from you within so many 100 or 1,000 kilometers. Now, again, there's a lot of areas of the world that are underserved. You can see large parts of Africa or large parts of South America, Russia, that doesn't exist. But these have been growing. I can remember when there were 28, 30, 32 regions. So over the years, Microsoft keeps opening new ones. But this is, I think, by far even larger than the availability, the number of regions that AWS has. So Microsoft has the most number of regions in the world. What this represents are places where you can get one of more of those Azure services. It's going to basically be, where are your users and do you want to put your services as close to them as possible? Of course. Now, the truth is not all of these regions are available to everyone. For instance, we can see that the US has a lot of government regions. There's Virginia, Texas, the Department of Defense. You're not going to have access to those unless you're involved in the US government. Also, China, you need to have a specific relationship with the Chinese company in order to get access to that, etc. One thing that's been relatively new within Microsoft environment is this concept of availability zones, although AWS has had this for a while. Within each of those regions, so if we go back, I'm going to scroll back to the map here. If we choose a region like North Central US as an example, then basically North Central US is actually consisting of multiple data centers. There's at least 2 data centers or more in that region that have got a little bit of geographic distance between them. So many miles or so many kilometers between these buildings. So presumably, if something was to happen, if there was to be a natural disaster of some sort, then chances are that one region would be good, even if the other region is taken offline. I'm going to go back to the map again. You'll see that there's these little diamonds that says availability zones. And not all of them have. There's more and more. So East US and East US 2 both have little diamonds. That means that it supports those 3 availability zones. Availability zones gives you as the consumer the ability to deploy your resources into those availability zones specifically. So if you're designing a system in East US and you want to have 3 web servers And you want those web servers to be distributed across 3 different buildings for the maximum amount of availability. Then you can actually specify web server 1 goes in zone 1, web server 2 goes in zone 2, and web server 3 goes in zone 3. So the availability zones is not available in all regions. It's only available in a few, but it gives you the maximum amount of control in terms of where your web servers and other servers get deployed. Now, one of the fundamental concepts within Azure is this concept of resource groups. So resource groups are basically a way of organizing resources. I often refer to them as a folder structure. We can see on screen a diagram of an example. At the bottom, you might have resources such as virtual machines, virtual networks, table storage, SQL database, or some other types of resources. These things get organized into resource groups. So similar to the way the files are stored into folders, resource groups are basically a way of grouping these. Now, you can even have multiple subscriptions, and so your resource groups themselves can be into specific subscriptions if you wanted to, and you can manage those subscriptions through a management group. So basically, it allows you to not only logically group them, but then you can do group operations. So resource groups can have security elements. You can, restrict access to specific employees. If you wanted to set up a resource group that must be used by things, that you can do that with Azure policy, etc. So it gives you organization, billing, and security on top of resources. Now, if you had any involvement in Azure at all, you may have heard of the Azure Resource Manager, or ARM, model of deployments. Now, this is relatively new. It's been out for 4 or 5 years now. But before that, Microsoft used another thing called the Azure Service Manager model, ASM. So the Resource Management model is relatively new. What that is, it's a common API that no matter how you interface with Azure, you're using the same API across all of them. So if you're using the portal, or you're using the command line, PowerShell, CLI, or you're using some kind of SDK, no matter how you're accessing Azure, it all goes through a common API, which means you have common functionality among all the different methods. This Azure Resource Manager then interprets those calls and basically passes on those commands to the virtual machines, to the networks, to all of the other elements. So basically, it's how you as a developer, operations manager, etc., interface with Azure. Now, there are many different benefits to using the ARM, Azure Resource Manager model, and those include the ability to deploy things as a group, so you can create multiple servers, multiple networks, and just put that as a package, deploy that all in one. You can repeatedly deploy these things, and so you have what are called ARM templates, and that can allow you to deploy the same solution every single time with no variance. You can use things in declarative templates, the ARM templates again. Access control, so there's a thing called role-based access control, RBAC, which allows you to make sure your resources are maximally secure, tagging, etc. So ARM, Azure Resource Manager, basically enables you to interface with Azure in a consistent way and provides you a bunch of different benefits.